Welcome to episode 3 of the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast, where we explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional. So, hello, my name's Matt. I'm here again with Curt and Gerry for episode 3. The first 2 episodes have been a blast. And so today we're going to talk about a concept called homeostasis. And if homeostasis, if you've just tuned in, he's like, that sounds like a nerdy thing. What's that have to do with trauma? Listen to this podcast. I can't think of a time that I've talked to about trauma for more than 45 minutes without talking about homeostasis. When we talk about the trauma-informed lens, to me, homeostasis has got to be a part of that discussion. And in my learning about trauma has really informed me about mental health issues, emotional issues, behavioral issues, all sorts of things where I can't talk too long without trauma without bringing in homeostasis. So I'm really excited to cover this topic today. As always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. So if this is your first podcast, you've got 3 nerds who get obsessed with things that we're learning about. So I'm going to start out this week and let Gerry go with his bright, shiny object of the week. Gerry, what do you got for us?
You know, I think my bright, shiny object of the week this week has to do with my experiences going into schools and going into treatment centers and seeing people struggle with this concept of safety and really having some deep discussions about balancing out safety of a group versus safety of the individual. And I think that seeing people really engage in both deep discussions, but also self-reflection, and also the dilemma that as we learn more about trauma, is trying to be sensitive to the individual needs of a child or a staff member versus what the group as a whole needs. And I think that it's really raised some really incredible discussions. And as always, as I engage in these processes, I learn a lot myself. So I think as we're doing this podcast, it keeps these thoughts in the front of my mind, and then I'm able to, in some ways, be really sensitive to how hard it is sometimes to change our paradigms. Yeah. Is that we have these neural tracks that have been laid down, and we start to think, but it creates anxiety for us. So that until we actually transition to a new paradigm, there's a lot of distress that goes on, and I've just really been amazed at how people are willing to stay in that process to kind of begin to look at it. So in schools, in treatment centers, in child welfare, it really is an exciting time.
Very cool. And safety is such a big topic. I know we'll get to that at some point, probably sooner rather than later, as far as our list of topics. So thanks, Gerry. Curt, what's your bright, shiny object of the week?
Oh, I thought of this yesterday and had a couple of wonderful experiences related to even a topic that I started talking a little bit in our first episode of my experience with using a reward system and using it incorrectly. Mm-hmm. That was one of the things that made me question what I was doing and whether or not what I was doing was the right thing. And I was, taking points away from a child for kicking a door in a group home, and it made it worse. And I was in several meetings over the course of this week where working with teachers and with parents, and I was coaching them on the use of a reward system, and it worked. And it actually turned into, when they did it correctly, a wonderful relational interaction between them and their students or them and their children. And I thought how kind of ironic it was that I had just talked about how I had screwed that up so much early in my career, and then later in my career could use it as an intervention to generate a positive relationship between parents and children and teachers in classrooms and their students. And that kind of struck me as I was driving home yesterday, thinking about what my bright, shiny object was going to be. It certainly kind of made me feel better about my previous failures in my career. So that was certainly something that was fun for this week.
Very cool, very cool. Just say it. I mean, I just kind of wonder how many millions in every classroom and residential treatment, like how many millions of behavioral management, reward, punishment systems we have out there, and when's the last time people have really rethought about those in a meaningful way? And boy, like I said, I shared some of my experiences as well, as I created every kind of level system you could imagine, and I'm not sure any of them did anything positive for anybody, except made me feel like I was doing something at least. So very cool. Hey, anything that works in our field is awesome. So my bright shiny object of the week sort of introduces the topic a little bit today as well, and it's a book that I really found fascinating, and I'm going to write about this in my blog that will come out, actually that you could read right now when this podcast comes out. And it was a book called White Trash, A 400-Year Untold History of Class in America by Nancy Eisenberg. And just to set up what I'm going to say next, she does a great job of really comparing different groups' experience with class in America, including, I think, our greatest class sin in America, which was our slavery. And so even though the title and somewhat the focus of the book is on white poverty and what sometimes gets called white trash, we've got a lot of names for it, trailer trash. I realized, being from Indiana, we call ourselves Hoosiers. Originally, Hoosiers was a sort of derogatory white trash sort of label that I guess we took back the word or didn't know people were making fun of us. So we just called ourselves that after a while, which was a little disturbing being from Indiana. But she does a really good job of comparing other experiences to the slavery experience. And the thing that what's got me thinking and sort of obsessed in the intellectual way I get about things that I read is really one of the class experiences that I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to, either in my studies on multiculturalism or different cultures, is really the poor white experience. And as I read her book, it was really powerful how at certain times in our history that poor whites, especially those that ended up in Appalachia from Scotland, Ireland, those sort of areas, were talked about even as a different race of people. And in some ways were despised as much, if not more, than other populations because they were kind of polluting the white race. So there was this white racism against other white people that just got me thinking about, as we're in this very intense political environment, and we got things like Charlottesburg and other things going on where race is a real trigger issue for so many of us right now, is, just because, and this is a thought I have, and I want to be careful with my words, but just because somebody might be white, their experience with class might be one that's impoverished and somewhat, I'm not sure if they're feeling white privilege in the same way that someone like me who has, being raised white in the middle class, my race has probably benefited me in ways that I'm not even aware of. And I'm just kind of wondering if some of those people that I'm pretty quick to judge, if they've really ever felt that, or their family have been struggling with poverty sometimes since they got off the boat and came to the United States. So it's just, I think for folks working with, historically impoverished white communities, it's a really important read. Again, it got me thinking about class and race in a little bit of a different way. And again, I think she does a good job of comparing this to other race and class issues as well. So interesting read. I've been obsessing about it ever since I picked it up, and I think got through it in a couple days. So again, White History, a 400-year untold history of class in America, gets the important read stamp of approval if you care about that coming from me. So I want to kind of transition because, again, this is sort of relevant to our topic of homeostasis. And when I talk about homeostasis, I bring in this dictionary definition, and I like it because it reminds me of my sophomore biology class, which before I got into the trauma literature was really the last time I heard the word homeostasis. I think it was about amoebas and how amoebas would adapt to their environment in certain ways. And so the dictionary definition to start out with, and then we'll obviously build upon this as we go through the podcast today, is the tendency towards a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, so elements that are connected to each other, especially as maintained by physiological processes. And I think as we talk a lot about, we're talking about these interdependent elements as being our biology, especially our neurobiology, and the environment that we're in. And a big part of that environment is also the relationships that we're in as well, and how our biology can adapt and adjust and develop according to the demands of the environment. And some of the consequences, I think, really good and bad from that, depending on your position in life, and unfortunately too often about sometimes where you were born and how you were raised, which obviously we wouldn't fault the individual for maybe being born into extreme poverty, being born into a violent situation. And so when I started to think about homeostasis, I went back early in my career, and early in my career I was working with gang members from downtown or inner city Indianapolis in Indiana, Hoosiers. And so these kids were coming out of what was one of the most violent gang wars in the United States at the time. Indianapolis was ranked up there with DC and Baltimore in the mid-late 90s during the crack epidemic for the murder capital of the United States. So these kids were coming out of an incredibly violent situation, and they would come in to my highly structured, we talk about behavioral management programs, my highly structured residential juvenile justice treatment facility, and most of them would fail miserably. I learned at times the one that succeeded were just really manipulating us really well, and I could appreciate that as a really good skill set. But that we told them when to get up in the morning, when to go to school, how to behave, when to go to group, when to eat lunch, and basically all my kids, they struggled in that highly structured environment, but they also struggled in school environments and other highly structured environments. But the other thing that I really struck me with a lot of these kids is that they were really surviving and thriving to some extent in this war zone that was happening in our community. Again, where a lot of these kids, their cousins got shot at, some of them lost family members, lost best friends. Every time you watch the local news in the Indianapolis area, there were usually 3 to 5 African-American youth were the main victims, dead on the streets every night. And they were growing up in this war zone. And, a few of my kids, I had this one kid in particular who I was just not connecting with. I was trying to do therapy and all this stuff with this kid. He just wasn't having any of it. And so I asked him one day, how much money do you make? And my BS radar was really good at the time, so I don't think he was pulling my leg. Probably a little exaggerated, but not much. And he says, and again, remember, this is the late 90s. He said, in a good month, I can pull in $10,000. And I was making $9.50 an hour at the time and still have yet to have a $10,000 month. And if you're not familiar with gang life, that's tax-free money. So, I thought about this kid, and he's always stuck with me, is here's a kid that grew up in what for a lot of us would be a total hell. Mom was addicted to crack cocaine. Mom had a boyfriend that was often abusive, that was also her dealer, was raised by his cousins that were in the gang. And even in this incredibly, when we talked last week about big T, small t trauma, his world from birth was filled with this. He found a way to thrive in some ways in that environment by making $10,000 a month. And so it just showed me how adaptive he was. And when now we took him out of that chaotic environment, put him in a well-structured environment, his brain and as a result his behaviors really struggled. Then I had just kind of this Freaky Friday. If you remember Freaky Friday, I haven't watched it for years, but some magical thing happens and the dad and the son change places. They change bodies. And I thought about this kid who was struggling in the environment with all my point systems and level systems and everything I had created. He was really struggling. I think his sentence got extended 2 months in his first 2 weeks because he got in fights. And so he was struggling in my environment. But then I thought about, and I'll take you guys with me and see, Gerry might do good. I don't know. He's very adaptive. But what if the three of us went smack dab into inner city Baltimore this afternoon and tried to sell crack, cocaine, and heroin the rest of the day? I would imagine we'd be shocked pretty quickly. My brain, all of a sudden, at the time, I was in grad school, even though I wasn't making any money, I was sort of going to the middle class. You put my brain in that kid's environment, and I'm dead. I'm probably dead. I have no idea how to sell crack cocaine. I have no idea what a drive-by shooting would look like. I'd have no idea what an undercover cop would look like. I would be lucky if I got arrested. And so it just really, as we think about homeostasis and the relationship between our biology, and again, as a result of that biology, sometimes our behaviors, our emotions, and our environment, it just really showed me in a powerful way that these kids were actually incredibly successful in their environment. Now, we've won a different level of success for them by all measures and means, but with what they were given in life, again, I've never made $10,000 a month tax-free. So it just gave me a way to sort of introduce homeostasis to myself, and I use that example in my trainings a lot as well. So, Gerry, I know you have some really good additions to that and are thinking about homeostasis. So I'll hand it off to you and throw your thinking and research around this into the discussion.
Well, thanks for handing that off. That was definitely a lot, Matt, to kind of. And I think what came to my mind is this concept of adaptation, and that there are certain adaptations that, for example, if we were going to go to war, I would want somebody with me who had experience being in a war.
Yeah. And
their bodies and their minds have adapted to that type of situation, right? And so adaptation is somewhat different than homeostasis. So homeostasis really is this, when you think about homeo, it means same, right? It's like we want to keep our body within some type of range of sameness. We want the same temperature, a balance of acids and alkalines. We want to kind of be able to do it. So as the environment puts demands on us, we want to somehow be able to maintain that, because that's the optimal environment for our cells and our bodies to function. So that homeostasis is these set points. The concepts of allostasis is those mechanisms that we engage in to maintain homeostasis. So they're both things that we do physiologically, and then there's behaviors we've learned to engage in that help us to maintain that, like eating and drinking and exercise, or whatever those things we engage in, that we try to maintain that senses. So in some ways, what we know is that if you were to take me and throw me into this environment that child is, it would be a period of time in which I would be dysregulated.
Yeah.
Over time, if I survived, based on yours, I would adapt and develop strategies to live in that environment that might allow me to both live in two environments, but it also may make it hard for me to come back to the environment I'm currently in. And I think that's one of the struggles we have when we're working with youth in treatment or adults in providing them is, you mentioned in some ways just giving somebody who's lived on the street a place to live now, is that their biology and what they've learned how to kind of regulate doesn't necessarily automatically translate to this new environment.
Yeah.
And that they want to kind of go back as opposed to work through that transitional period of time.
Yeah.
To look at that. So one of the incredible abilities we have as a species is our adaptability, is that we can live in almost any habitat on the planet.
Yeah.
But what we also know is some of the ways that we engage in to keep our homeostatic equilibrium tend to have long-term wear and tear on our bodies. And that's the term they use for allostatic load, which means that if we're eating and drinking and doing it, it may make us feel better and more regulated, but over time, it begins to have negative impacts on our body. And we could talk more about that as we go on, but this combination of maybe that some of those behaviors that young man has learned to adapt to his environment has helped him survive, but really what's the life expectancy of that young man in that environment as opposed to the life expectancy? So there's some consequences to the way that we adapt.
Absolutely. And I, you see this, and I started even before I had great language around this. It's like, okay, how can I see what they've done as a strength and not just focus on the behaviors that are struggling to adapt. One of the things I did with my gang members, which I've always not been sure if I caused the financial crash a few years back, but I started bringing in Wall Street journals. And these kids had better supply, demand, sales, market factors at age 15 than, when I got my MBA. These kids would run circles around that class because they were living this and really had adapted to this market economy in some ways. And there were real strengths there. But, the other thing, too, that I really came into thinking about is, boy, we would pull them out of their community sometimes for 6 months or 9 months. And then most of the kids went right back into their community. And so, when we think about what are we doing to these kids, hopefully they gained some skills in the residential treatment center, which hopefully some of them did, to take back into their lives. But boy, you throw someone right back into the war zone, again, it kind of made me rethink about what I was trying to do and help these kids as far as I want them to thrive in life, go to college, do this. But, sometimes I had to think about how do they survive the next 2 or 3 years without getting shot, which is a whole different way to think about treatment too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gerry.
I think Curt could talk somewhat about that, but this is about trauma informed, and I think what you're really kind of hitting on, Matt, is how do we see what we define as problems or symptoms has been this individual's solution to adapting to their environment, which is a strength-based model.
Yeah.
So I think what you're alluding to is how do we begin to shift that lens to really understanding that what this individual is doing was very adaptive for them, which may not necessarily continue to be adaptive.
Absolutely.
For them. So, if you have learned how to live in an environment where there's lack of food and there's lack of resources, your body adjusts to living in that environment. But then if I put you back in an environment where there's like 1,000 calorie blueberry muffin available, that's not adaptive anymore.
Yeah.
So you really have to begin to look at some of that, and a lot of how that gets manifested is our learning history, which I think Curt could really maybe talk a little bit about.
Go for it, Curt.
And even, while Matt, while you were giving your lead in and your story about working in inner cities, and Gerry, while you were talking as well, I was thinking about how many levels of this concept of homeostasis and adaptation got referenced in all of those things. And so you have you start with a cellular level, and then you can go from there to an internal systems level, and then an organismal level, and then to an organizational level, and then to a city level. All of those got touched on in the course of talking about all of those things. I mean, we know that systems are driven to maintain some level of sameness. And then one of the most wonderful things about us is that we can adapt. That we don't have to stay at sameness, and we can certainly learn very quickly how to respond to our environment effectively, which is probably one of the things that got me so interested in the science of behavior early on in my career, is that aspect of how wonderfully complex this phenomena can be and how quickly it can change, and it can respond to environmental impact or stressors. And go back to our conversation last week of, what is trauma and what is stress, and that a stressor is an environmental event that is meant to organize our behavior, and that we as organisms learn how to do that. And we learn over time how to maintain these steady states of safety and making sure that we as an individual are safe, and then we as collectives become safe. And we learn to manage those things in really kind of fun ways to watch and learn about. So those are certainly some of the thoughts that I had while we were talking, and see so much of how taking our time with when change happens. I mean, it certainly helps with your understanding of how change can be very transient, and it can be very temporary, and it can go in fits and starts, and go from change happens and then we go back, and then we can change again, and then we can go back. And that mirrors very well this concept of homeostasis, and that our biology is driven to do that. That we can change in temporary moments to deal with environmental demands, and then we get back to a set baseline. And that's how we as organisms are designed. And this metaphor of homeostasis and applying it to larger systems, including organizations, is certainly, I think, an exciting thing about the trauma-informed paradigm, is a shift in the way that the metaphors essentially that we're using to understand organizational dynamics or group dynamics and individual dynamics, I think is something that is so exciting about this paradigm. And I think all of those things got touched on. It's such a big topic that you could go on for quite a while. We just talked about 6 different levels of applying a concept. So super fascinating. That could go on for many podcast episodes to keep talking about it.
Yeah. So I want to some of my thinking, especially Gerry, you talked about working in schools. One of the earliest environments that we adapt to is obviously our home environment. And for a lot of kids, especially kids that I see unfortunately living in poverty that I've worked with for most of my career, that environment is oftentimes pretty stagnant. It makes me, living in Denver now with both of you, I'm amazed at how many kids that look at the Rocky Mountains every day that you can see from wherever you're at in Denver have never been up to the mountains. And so a lot of these kids are pretty local to their experience. And, when we talk about big T, small t traumas, where there may be dysregulation in the home due to domestic violence, addiction, mental illness of a parent, incarceration of a parent, whatever it might be, thinking about the impact of, again, when I look at homeostasis, thinking about the brain sort of adapting to survive or thrive in the environment that it's in, through its behaviors, through its emotional reactions to things, whether that's for a lot of my kids that I've worked with, I know you guys too, surviving those environments. And then we put that kid into another sort of extensive environment, which is a school setting. Which is in many ways maybe the first homeostasis, the second environment for a lot of these kids then becomes the school. And I've really kind of thought, Gerry, since you brought that up with your bright, shiny object, thinking about how should schools think about that, and I put this in air quotes, and I hate air quotes, but the bad kid, I hate that terminology, but every teacher you talk to will know what you're talking about, that we see these sets of behaviors as maladaptive in kindergarten or first grade, but that's sort of the behaviors they've had all their life and they're normal. And I just kind of want to, I'd love to get your thinking on that piece and how that initial change in environment can be so impactful for educational, employment, and life outcomes.
Again, is a huge topic to think about, right? Because you know, when you're in your house and you're an infant or a toddler, you may not know that you're poor, right?
Yeah.
You don't look around and say, well, I'm poor and I'm doing it. What determines whether your needs are met is the interpersonal interactions that you have, and your caretaker's ability to be able to read your cues, to be able to make meaning of your cues, and then to respond in a timely and effective manner. And if you have a healthy, good caregiver around you, you're basically wealthy, right? You having your needs met, you're kind of looking at that. And what interferes with that is the stress on the caregiver, both the current stress and the historical stress, to kind of look at. So that this child who comes into the world is a first environment they're adapting to is the psychological world of their parent. And they're learning how to get their needs met. They're learning the language and the style of interacting with this caregiver in a way to survive and get their needs met.
Yeah.
So that is the way that we begin to form templates of what's expected of us and how we're basically going to do that. Well, now what you're talking about is leaving that nest and then going to this complex social environment that we call a school.
Yeah.
In which now I have to interact with these adults who may have very different ways and expectations. It's almost like talking a different relational language.
Exactly.
And we have
Yes.
to kind of begin to do it. And we know that novelty in itself creates a stress, right? So schools have to not assume that children are coming in with the same relational language.
Yeah.
They have to begin to say how do I create some sense of safety, a sense of belongingness, and then connection, that we begin to learn how to, in some ways, what are the rules in this environment that I have to get my needs met to do. And that's a process. It isn't an expectation that goes on.
Yeah.
And for lots of kids coming in, the home environment has been similar, so that I've been trained to adapt to this environment, where other children come in, and because of their family's history or because of their cultural background or because of the stresses they're on, they have to actually more resources, time, and effort has to go into helping them to adapt to this new environment.
Yeah.
And I think that we tend to kind of, for teachers in school traditionally, has the expectations that you come to school already ready to learn, as opposed to the school has to create the experience that optimizes your ability to learn. So I don't necessarily talk any longer about trauma-informed schools, because I think the word trauma kind of connotates something negative in some ways, and also gets a defensiveness from teachers thinking, I'm not a therapist, so what's trauma? I like to talk about the concept of creating a safe, optimal learning environment.
Yeah.
And that is really the components that go into creating a safe, optimal learning environment is good for all kids.
Yeah.
We're kind of looking at that. So I think that when we talk about safety, we talk about connectedness, we talk about really the ability to help kids master their developmental steps that they're on. All of those things create optimal opportunities for them to use the parts of our brain that make us uniquely human, that allow us to learn, that allow us to not only think about the present based on the past, but also to envision a future and then work towards a goal to achieve those kinds of things. So we're open to learning new experiences. So that's really what I work with when I'm looking at schools, is really to begin to help them say what do we need to build in to help create those type of experiences that help kids to feel safe enough to explore and learn and grow.
Great.
You know,
I'd love to get your follow-up on that. Let me even challenge you a little bit more. I'm having fun today, just throwing out the big questions. Let's say you had a group of kids that are coming out of highly stressed home environments, where there is some of that big T, small t complex trauma going on at a very young age because of maybe poverty, their parents struggle with maybe their own mental health or addiction or this, that, or the other. You got these kids coming in that we can expect, and this is kind of what I hope to end with, some maybe behavioral problems, deregulation coming out of that. Where would you, from a behavioral perspective, I just start creating level systems, which is never effective necessarily. Where would you sort of start from the behavioral perspective with those?
Yeah, that is a really, really good, it's a good question. And I was thinking, while Gerry was talking about when we start to, in human beings, when we start to cross the line between homeostasis from just a biological standpoint to the learning history standpoint is in our use of language. And what we find with talking with folks is that you learn from people that they generate different rules that govern their behavior based on the environments that they have been in. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about, even you ask employees who work for you, how do they think about their job? How do they think about how they're effective? Or ask a student, how do they think about how they're effective in an environment? And starting there, I think, is an incredibly important part to find out about how people have generated the rules that make them effective in their environment. One of the best things about being a human being is that we can learn from each other, and we can share these kind of rules with each other. And we don't have to learn everything by sticking your finger in every single light socket to find out that that's not a good idea. I can ask Gerry, is this a good idea? And he'd be like, yeah, I tried that once.
Or twice.
I get
twice.
He's like, I tried that many, many times. Don't do it.
You get a good sample size before you make conclusions.
Absolutely. But I get to benefit from Gerry's years of experience of doing the same kind of work that I do. And I get to ask you about, how do you think about talking in front of a group of people, and how do I do that better? I get to learn from you how to do that if I ask how you think. And if I'm curious about how you think about things and what rules you use to govern your own actions in any environment that I'm not familiar with, and I get to learn that. So when you start thinking about, your question's great about developing, how do you develop reward systems and motivational, because you need motivational interventions in this field. Yeah. And how do you do it in a way that's meaningful? I start with understanding how that person thinks about how they're effective in their environment, and use that to start to alter the development of the reward system to match with how they think about their effectiveness. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's kind of a game changer in the development of motivation, that it matches the intervention with the motivation of the individual. Yeah. And that can't be, overstated how important that is.
And not thinking what would motivate me if I was in their situation. I mean, that was such a huge, that theory of the mind, where if you're not familiar with that concept, a lot of times it's why we think we know what our dog's feeling, right? We're great as human beings as saying, hey, if I was in that person's position, this is what I would think, this is what I feel. And sometimes we do this unconsciously. But boy, what motivates me, and I wish somebody would just slap me across the face with this somewhere in my education, what motivates me is not going to motivate that kid that grew up on the streets. He may be thinking every night about, how am I going to survive when I go back? Or how am I going to survive in this residential care? Because as a community, we decided to put 2 rival gangs in one cottage and put me in charge of the whole thing. You know, and so it's that I had to really step out of myself and say, okay, how do I understand this person's experience and motivation? And that's something that I think, you know, as communities, as policymakers, as educators, we sort of can miss that in a very big way. I want to throw out another question to both of you. Go ahead, Gerry.
Before you go, and I had a thought, and I want to just throw it out, is there's this concept of rules and talking to each other about that, which implies a conscious awareness of why you're doing something. And what we know is so much of our behavior is governed by a part of our brain that doesn't have language and really we're not conscious of. And so we learn, especially very early in life, but also we know that when we're under a great deal of stress, that part of our brain that records things in language shuts down, so that we engage in behaviors that are what we call procedural learning or emotional learning, that we really don't have really a conscious awareness of it. And then when you ask me about it, I make up some narrative to explain why I'm doing it. But really what's happening is I'm engaged in an automatic behavioral response to a situation that was in some ways learned in the past and is not necessarily adaptive to the present situation. And I think that when we're talking about trauma, we have to understand that many of the ways that individuals are interacting is not a conscious thought that they're having, that they're being in some ways triggered or activated by something in the current environment that's engaging an automatic behavioral response that's related to something in the past.
Yeah.
So I want us to both be able to have this awareness that because we have the capacity to make decisions on how we're responding to some extent, but for many of the individuals we're going to be working with or interacting with, is that they lose the capacity to be able to respond to the current situation, and they lose the ability to even have the awareness that what they're responding to is something from the past and not to the present. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that that's a really important distinction to make between explicit, conscious rules and decision making and automatic behavioral responses to situations.
I love finding these areas where between the behavioral paradigm and the non-behavioral, put everything else in the non-behavioral paradigm, actually they agree with each other, and we just use different words to talk about them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the behavioral paradigm, we talk about that as contingency-shaped behavior versus rule-governed behavior. And we found in the literature that they have fundamentally different properties about them. Mm-hmm. And so that's a great example of how we just use different words to talk about the same environmental phenomena.
So tell me about contingency for the people outside listening to this podcast. Talk about it.
Contingency is a word that describes a relationship in time and causation between environmental events and behavior. That they are close to each other in time, and that my behavior actually caused something to happen. So we'll go back to the light socket example. If I walk over and I stick my finger in a light socket, I get shocked. I learned from an environmental interaction that that's not a good idea. And that is a different way of learning about that experience. And if I go to Matt and say, what's that thing over there? And if I stick my finger in it, will it hurt? And he says, yeah, don't do that. It hurts really, really bad. And I never stick my finger in light sockets from then on. I learn the same response, but in a fundamentally different way. And learning in those two different ways, they're actually, they have a differential response to intervention when we try and change them. That one of them is much harder to change than the other. and one is much more flexible than the other. So we find this, it's very similar things in both an understanding of what happens in the brain then and what happens in our behavior. They match up very, very well. That if a response is learned in a very cognitive sense, it's a little easier to change things in the cognitive area of the brain than it is in things that happen in the limbic system and in the brainstem. And in a very similar way, that there's a difference there between what we call contingency shaped and rule governed behavior.
Yeah. And I think the learn piece for me too, thinking about, you know, and the thing with homeostasis that I find so powerful is when we talk about the trauma-informed lens, it informs so much of my thinking. You know, thinking about even things like what we see around police violence in the African-American community right now. You know, so many of, I grew up being taught, again, being lucky enough to be born middle class in a very stable, healthy family for the most part, you know, to respect police. We didn't like getting pulled over when we were speeding, but we didn't ever think we were going to get shot when that happened. And I think for so many of the kids that I grew up with, it was their families didn't trust this group of people, law enforcement, because they have had bad experiences going back sometimes generations with maybe not just police, but people in power in general, and all these learned behaviors that you need. And I think I'm always fascinated with the bridges out of poverty sort of work that I've just kind of sat with that a lot, because, you know, in her work, she talks about the rules of and the lessons kind of poverty and the values of poverty, which I don't know. I always struggle with the language, but the point is that you learn a certain set of behaviors and reactions to survive in that economic situation. What I do agree is sometimes what you learned, or what my kids learned to survive out in the gang war on the streets, was a very different set of learned behaviors than what it took to go to college and graduate with honors. The fact that some of my kids were able to do that is in some ways by a lot, it's not a miracle per se. That's an overstretch or an underestimation of the human ability, but I just got to appreciate that, boy, they were raised in an environment that sent these messages that, again, I always like to say our brain prioritizes our survival more than anything else. Is then they'd come to me and I'd want to talk to them about going to school when probably every night they're worried about some family members getting shot on the street. And so who's going to have the more powerful message, what they see on the news, or, you know, the white therapist that's coming in and wanting them to think about college and getting a great job and living the middle-class American dream, when that's not been what they've learned or what their family's been really focused on because of that survival sort of piece. And it really helps me think from a societal level how, as long as we allow kids to grow up in some of these situations, you know, and as long as schools don't sort of recognize that this isn't a bad kid who wakes up every day as an 8-year-old and decides, I'm going to make my teacher's life hell today, that we can't be surprised anymore that we see the criminal behavior or the lack of motivation as it's seen from an outside perspective. So, boy, with my trauma-informed lens, at least, homeostasis informs so much of my thinking along those lines.
That's, you know, that's why when Matt, if you think about it, is much of what we're talking about is a learned behavior at a very primitive part of our nervous system.
Yeah.
What are the cues in the environment? What are the things that represent opportunities and what represents threat, and how do I adapt to them, right? And
yeah.
So, and that's passed on not only, which you'll talk about in other, passed on not only on our current experiences, but from generation to generation.
Yeah.
So I think that's why sometimes you can actually live in a very different environment. You know, you could grow up in a dangerous community and learn how to adapt to that. but you're very bright, and then you go to school and you get a good job, and you go on and you're very successful, but you're a person of color. And you go into some place and you're reacting to cues that you're very sensitive of that are really indication of oppression, of bigotry, right? Where I might not be picking those up, but that individual's, and you say is, well, why are you talking about oppression and bigotry? You have lots of money and you have lots of, right? Their nervous system isn't just about where they're currently at, but it's about, it lives in their bodies. And they can make different decisions on how to respond to those cues. So it really isn't just about where you're at.
Yeah.
It's really about what your ancestral and cultural experiences have been up to that point, which I think is why sometimes, you know, what you say is, well, when I get stopped by a police officer, my nervous system says something very different than, say, an African-American male who may be very successful, but their system is saying there's a threat here.
Yeah.
Even though that officer may not be doing anything that in some ways is creating, their nervous system is telling them that this is dangerous.
Absolutely.
So I think that we sometimes look at individuals and think you really shouldn't be having that reaction.
Yeah.
Because you don't live that, or you didn't grow up in poverty, you grew up in a middle-class family. But their parents grew up with that and actually, in some ways, conditioned their nervous system to pick up cues in the environment of that way. So I think we could get really into this topic, but I think that's where being open and curious about somebody's experience rather than us putting our lens and judging them for having it is a really important way of interacting with people, both from the same culture, but also from different cultures.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, this is where, again, when we talk about that lens we see the world through and how this research has really, for all of us, changed that lens. It can apply to so many things. And I think that the takeaway is I know we could talk about this for another 3 hours, but we won't do that to our audience, is, you know, how do we bring this understanding to people who create policies, who don't have this information, so that we can start to build empathy for the why behind a lot of these behaviors, and that these people, again, are not bad people. That they're people that often have survived in pretty intense environments. So I'm going to transition to Gerry's question of the week here in a second, but I want to build the bridge because we're going to continue this discussion on our next week's podcast as well, diving a little deeper in two really fascinating topics that are highly related to homeostasis, which is epigenetics, which for me helps explain the science behind how we adapt to certain environments, and how we can change our biology and neurobiology over time to adapt. And then the topic of intergenerational trauma, which kind of takes epigenetics out of one lifespan and looks at how trauma can get transmitted. And I'm sure we'll approach this from several different ways, from generation to generation, and how trauma can be carried on in many ways through our DNA and genetics, which I find is a real fascinating piece in this whole discussion. So, Gerry, what's your question of the week for us this week?
Well, I'm going to try to have something related to the unbelievably broad topics we doing. But what it makes me think of is the concept of unconscious bias, in that really we all have things that we have associated and get triggered and activated by, which doesn't necessarily mean in our cortex we have to respond to them. But if we're not aware of them, we're going to be unconsciously making judgments about other people and other people's behavior based on our experience rather than on their experiences.
Yeah.
So what I think is really the question of the week really is, as you begin to deal with clients, pay attention and notice what you're experiencing internally and what judgments you come up with in a compassionate way. Rather than saying, I don't want to be judgmental, is just pay attention and notice that. And then you can make a decision, because the more aware we are of our own internal reactions, the more we can make a decision of how we want to, in some ways, guide our adaptation rather than automatically adapting. So let's take this discussion and bring it into increasing our own self-awareness this week.
Excellent, excellent. So looking at the unconscious bias piece, which again I think
about Curt. What's on?
Yeah, we'll let Curt paraphrase that into a question. We may need to give him an hour to do so. We don't want to rush that
because you used the phrase. The question really is.
I know.
It's such a Gerryism.
It is a Gerryism.
Really, the question is.
So we'd love to get your answers. You can go to Trauma-Informed Lens, all one word.org, the comment section. Also, feel free to go there and shoot us any questions as well. We keep an eye on that. So love to have a discussion with our growing community. I had to explain to my mother this morning what a podcast is. So if anybody has a good answer to that, please put it in the comments so I can communicate that to my mother as well. So I want to thank everybody.
Because you had to explain it to me last week. So.
Yeah, I know, that's true. You give me good practice, Gerry.
Give it Gerry. He can do it now.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us for episode 3. Again, we're going to continue this discussion and looking a little deeper into homeostasis next week, and we hope you join us. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.